Tonight, we won't follow banners into battle or trace routes across a broken map. Instead, we'll begin in a winter square where a priestess voice drifts between snowflakes and candle smoke. The crowd listens as though warmth could be earned by believing hard enough. Promises are handed out like letters sealed in gold wax, each one declaring that faith, travel, and forgiveness can all be packed into the same bag. Somewhere, a bell leans into the wind. Horses stamp against the cold. Men nod to words they half understand but fully want to believe. They are told that sin can be measured in distance, that heaven waits at the end of a road drawn by someone else's hand. The parchment glows in the light, the ink still wet, the silence between sentences heavier than the snow. So lower the lights. Let the sound of that bell drift through your room. And if your breathing begins to match its slow rhythm, steady, patient, almost certain that's just the night reminding you that every grand promise begins as a whisper. If quiet stories like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share the time and place you're listening from, perhaps the next vow will remember you there. And somewhere beyond that quiet square, a voice is already climbing the cold air. You can almost hear the parchment crack as another sermon unfolds, one that promises the same road, the same forgiveness, only louder this time. The crowd shifts, boots crunching frost, faces lit by faith and torchlight. They are not thinking about maps or hunger or the weight of armor. Only the word go, stretched long enough to sound holy. The vow has already changed shape. It is no longer a whisper in the dark, but a public order written in ink that smells faintly of melted wax and certainty. A promise too bright to question, too grand to test. And beneath it all, the snow keeps falling, erasing every footprint that might have led them back home. The preaching made everything sound simple. Edessa had fallen, Christendom's pride had a visible dent. Therefore, everyone would walk east once more and push the map back into its previous, more comforting shape. Kick the cross, sew the cloth, follow the banners. Copies of Bernard's letters were carried from abbeys to courts to parish pulpits, repeating the same bright phrases until they felt like instructions printed on the inside of consciousness. The idea that the First Crusade, as apparent success might not automatically repeat, did not fit well into the rhythm of his sentences, so it stayed mostly between the lines, where almost no one reads. Charters, songs, and vows recycled the vocabulary of certainty, offering spiritual profit at a favorable rate of exchange. Invest one difficult journey, receive eternity with interest. Knights heard a story where their honor and God's honor were perfectly aligned. Rulers heard a story in which decisive action would make them look like guardians of the faith, instead of men whose borders leaked. Scribes drew neat crosses beside the names of those who took the vow, as if the checkmarks themselves guaranteed efficient supply lines. Anxious questions about who would command, how they would feed tens of thousands of humans and animals along routes already grazed thin, and whether earlier allies still felt allied were postponed in favor of more uplifting verbs. Under that smooth language, the Second Crusade began its life with two crowns standing side by side and not especially inclined to move in step. Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany each envisioned himself as a natural centerpiece, like two pillars both assuming the other is ornamental. On parchment, they were united in purpose. In reality, each traveled with his own orbit of advisors, chroniclers, cooks, and relatives who preferred not to be outranked. Both kings had to keep promises to their own nobles, soothe rivalries back home, and manage egos that did not pack neatly into a single command tent. No one produced a clear diagram explaining who would listen to whom if opinions collided somewhere between the Danube and Damascus. Instead, everyone leaned on the comfortable notion that holy enthusiasm would smooth over practical disagreements. As if reverence were a sort of universal lubricant you could pour onto a wagon axle and also onto a quarrel. Every promise to the Pope ran alongside promises to vassals and allies in towns, and those threads crossed without being firmly tied. Recruitment letters talked about unity, while itineraries quietly assumed separation. Before the great hosts had marched a mile, they already existed as parallel columns of expectation, slightly out of rhythm with each other, all convinced that coordination would materialize later, like a road appearing underfoot just in time. When diplomacy followed, it arrived on parchment crisp enough to impress any candlelit audience. Agreements with Byzantium described passage, markets, ferries, and support in language that looked generous while carefully protecting the empire's own skin. Emperor Manuel I Comnenos had no intention of letting enormous Western hosts wander his territory like unsupervised houseguests who promised to stay only a few days. He signed treaties that offered guidance and supplies while quietly talking with Seljuk neighbors to keep the real trouble at arm's length. This was not simple treachery so much as risk management conducted by a man who had read history and did not want his capital remodeled by visitors. Many Western knights, not particularly fluent in nuance, chose to interpret every delay as hostility. A ferry that did not arrive on the expected morning became whispered proof that Constantinople hated them. A restriction on foraging near imperial estates felt like insult rather than self-preservation. Guides insisting on particular roads were suspected of luring them somewhere unpleasant, rather than, say, trying to keep several thousand hooves away from fragile irrigation ditches. By the time the crusading forces reached the Bosporus, they carried with them not only baggage and relics, but a thin film of suspicion that stuck to every future conversation. Behind the diplomatic front, maps and route plans were produced by men who had not personally tried leading tens of thousands of people through Anatolia in the warm months. Lines were drawn from one town name to another with a confidence that looks peaceful on paper. The agreements rarely lingered on small practicalities, like the exact capacity of wells, the distance between drinkable streams, or the cheerful habit of Seljuk forces to avoid heroic stand-up fights in favor of making other people walk in circles until thirsty. Papers suggested that with proper faith and a firm schedule, the land would behave. Reports from earlier travelers who mentioned sparse grazing, vanishing paths, and hospitable villages that turned less hospitable when stripped by previous armies sat quietly in archives, less fashionable than the uplifting rhetoric. Measuring distances with a finger on a map made everything look manageable. So the armies advanced east with letters that were beautifully sealed and only lightly informed, carrying diagrams that treated mountains as polite decorations rather than time-consuming realities. Out on the ground, Conrad's German host met the landscape first, and the landscape, being under no obligation to match brochures, responded with long distances, bad tracks, and selective water. The army moved heavy and stretched, armor and wagons trailing up narrow paths, screens too thin to keep curious enemies from exploring the edges. Seljuk horse archers, entirely uninterested in theatrical charges, preferred to ride at a distance, turn dust into a strategy, and let heat and hunger do part of the work. Every extra day on the road frayed animals and men, and there were rather a lot of both. Ambushes near Dorylium did not have to be apocalyptic to be effective. Confusion alone could send columns recoiling, supplies scattered, and parchment plans quietly irrelevant. Chroniclers later searching for noble speeches mostly found weary men trying to decide which way they had come from. When Conrad's survivors turned back toward Nicaea, what had been advertised as a bold advance had, in slow motion, become a lesson about how optimism shrinks under the sun and how little a sermon weighs compared to an empty cart. Louis VII's French column, following later, found a route already bitten. Markets were strained, forage stripped, tempers warmed. Their own baggage train moved along slopes and ravines that seemed designed to tip things over at exactly the wrong moment. Paths that looked like roads from a distance dissolved into loose stone 1 boot width wide. Every turn invited someone to drop something important, usually loudly. At night, watchfires flickered in passes where nobody was entirely sure who was on which side of which ridge. Rumor outpaced messengers, adding imaginary disasters to the real ones. A king-on campaign is expected to look like a plan dressed in velvet. Instead, Louis often found himself presiding over a carefully documented muddle. Scouts warned of hostile riders and missing supplies. Prayers and formal courage answered them more quickly than revised logistics. Somewhere in those mountains, a great deal of prestige quietly converted itself into experience. By the time the host reached the coast, the aura of invincibility had thinned into something more transparent, like a banner left too long in weather, its colors still visible but flapping with less conviction. Meanwhile, the Holy War's balance sheet had begun to lean in anticlimactic ways. The remnants that arrived in the eastern Mediterranean still wore crosses, still recited vows, but they did so with lighter numbers and heavier doubts. The sharp, ringing promises about retaking Edessa dimmed into softer suggestions about what might be feasible instead. Letters from local lords, full of their own priorities, intersected with papal expectations and royal pride, producing meetings in which everybody agreed that something impressive should be done without quite settling what. Plans circled around targets that were nearer, easier, or politically convenient. Grand speeches mentioned the original cause, but the ink of strategy kept sliding away from it. No one wanted to say plainly that the rescue mission had arrived late and underfed. Instead, they adjusted objectives in careful sentences, as if the campaign's original purpose had always been a set of gentle, flexible recommendations. If you look at it from a distance without the need for trumpet flourishes, the Second Crusade turns into a collection of small, preventable misalignments. A sermon that promised more than planning could sustain. Two kings walking in parallel rather than together. Treaties written with one cautious eye on real geography and one hopeful eye on public opinion. Maps that fit comfortably on a table but not on a continent. None of these alone was dramatic. Together, they bent the path downward almost imperceptibly. The disaster, such as it was, arrived by accumulation, not explosion. It leaked quietly into letters, supply lists, and marginal notes in chronicles that mentioned more attrition than glory, more waiting than charging. If anyone had wanted a single decisive mistake to blame, they would have been disappointed. The Crusade's troubles were boringly well distributed. In that sense, the whole project had spent most of its strength before anyone reached the places listeners back home imagined when they heard the phrase. Holy Land, resources, trust, and patience were all eroded and root by choices that felt reasonable in council chambers, and less so when measured and empty. Cisterns and missing horses. What was framed as a heroic answer to loss became, step by step, an exercise in managing consequences. The story does not need a single fatal moment to make sense. It drifts along the way its leaders kept assuming that faith or reputation would fix details yet unfixed. Watching it unfold on the page is like watching someone assemble complex furniture without reading the smaller print, confident that all loose pieces will find their own place eventually as long as one believes firmly in the instruction booklet. So we leave it here for tonight, in that long pause before any final sieges or official verdicts, with banners still hanging, letters still being drafted, and men still walking along stony tracks that no sermon had properly described. The Great Rescue is already tired, its edges frayed by harmless-sounding decisions and politely worded misunderstandings, its maps curling a little at the corners. Nothing explodes on cue. The noise is mostly boots on dry ground, pack animals sighing, pens on parchment, and distant hooves that might belong to allies or scouts or no one of consequence. The outcome is leaning in a particular direction, quietly, like a heavy cart that was pushed off-center a long way back. And if your eyes are heavy now, you can let them close on that image. A grand overpromised journey stretching out ahead, already persuaded by all the small things left vague at the vet. Start continuing on without you while your thoughts slip gently elsewhere. You might not expect a single wooden bar stretched across a dusty road to hold together so many small pieces of history, but for a long time that is exactly what medieval toll gates tried to do. A cart would roll up, the bar would stay down, and nothing particularly heroic would happen until someone counted the wheels and decided what that meant in coins. If you were somehow still awake by the time we reached the surcharge for unsupervised geese, you are very welcome to subscribe for more of this quietly overregulated landscape. But truly, do not feel obliged to remain conscious in order to support international tariff. Standardization from the 13th century. Falling asleep while someone itemizes axle fees is almost a form of participation. Along the long routes between towns and markets, toll houses appeared like small, practical punctuation marks. They were rarely grand, a hut or stone booth by a bridge, a gate tower at a city entrance, sometimes just a post with a hinged beam that could be lowered across the way. Their purpose was both simple and endlessly adjustable. If you passed, you paid. The amount depended on what you brought, how many animals pulled it, what the local lord or council had most recently decided, and how awake the collector felt at that hour. Tariff tables were written down on boards or in books, listing fees for carts, pack horses, flocks, barrels, bales, and in some particularly thorough places, individual pigs. The numbers did not have to be elegant. They only had to be written with enough flourish to look official. Travelers would squint at the list, see something about 2 deniers for a laden mule, compare it with their own animal, decide it was close enough, and reach for their purse. The gatekeeper, sitting in the shade of the beam, did not need to give a speech about state formation or infrastructure. He simply raised or lowered a piece of wood at the correct speed. The toll itself was part tax, part rent, part contribution to maintenance, and part opportunity for very small miscalculations. Bridges had to be repaired, ditches cleared, roads scraped into something like a flat line. Local authorities would explain, in tidy Latin, that the money gathered at the bar before the northern gate would ensure safe passage and sturdy planks. Sometimes it even did. There are accounts of specific beams paid for by tolls, named and priced down to the last nail. There are also notes about funds quietly redirected to more decorative purposes, like frescoes or better chairs for council meetings. Still, the theory was stable. Those who used the road helped pay for it. A familiar idea, only delivered more slowly, with a better view of hedgerows. The gatekeeper, whose wages also came from this stream, occupied an in-between role, part official, part neighbor, part reluctant weather forecaster for anyone asking about mud ahead. Traffic itself was counted with a mix of care and resignation. 1 mule with 2 packs was straightforward. 2 mules with uncertain pack distribution invited brief philosophical reflection. Was a cart pulled by 4 oxen more damaging than one pulled by 2? Toll said yes. A narrow bridge might charge extra for heavily laden wagons, claiming concern for the structure, as if the beams could read ledgers. Some stations listed different prices for locals and foreigners, reflecting a fond belief that geography affects wear on timber. There were attempts at exemptions, clergy on certain missions, messengers carrying urgent letters with impressive seals, nobles with documents that said they had already paid somewhere else. The keeper would hold the paper up, consider the wax, maybe admire the handwriting, and decide whether this justified lifting the bar for free. In a sense, every toll gate was a small theater of trust, skepticism, and handwriting analysis. Because people are very good at looking for cheaper ways around beams, there were also rules about byways, those tempting tracks that slipped off into woods or fields to avoid the official point of payment. Authorities responded with quiet ingenuity. Some charters ban the creation of new paths within a certain distance of the gate. Others allowed landowners to block or redirect them with hedges, ditches, or politely stubborn fences. Patrols were sent sometimes, not in dramatic pursuit, but in leisurely rides to see whether anyone had become creative with detours. Chroniclers mention confiscated carts and short-lived free crossings that lasted until someone important's patience ran out. Yet even here, the tone is more weary than angry. The system expected a certain amount of leakage, like a bucket that has chosen to tolerate 2 or 3 holes. As long as most people stopped to pay under the beam, the arrangement held. Inside the toll house, the tools of this unassuming trade collected their own history. A chest with several compartments kept coins sorted by type, clinking softly as the day went on. A wax tablet or a strip of parchment recorded entries. So many carts of wool, so many barrels of ale, 1 herd of swine, sometimes with annotations about weather or behavior. The handwriting could be surprisingly elegant for such prosaic content. Quills and sand for drying ink lay beside crumbs from the gatekeeper's lunch. On cold days, a brazier smoldered nearby, slightly perfuming the official records. It was a life of repetitions. Lower bar, greet traveler, recite tariff if requested, accept coins, make a mark, lift bar. On quiet afternoons, you can imagine the keeper estimating from memory how many loads of timber had passed that season and whether the bridge downstream would complain. It is a cadency conducted at walking speed because nothing is too small for ceremonial habits. Some important visitors demanded the bar be raised before they arrived, so their progress would not be interrupted like ordinary traffic. They sent riders ahead with instructions. The bishop is coming, or the duke, or the king's cousin. Please make sure no one has to wait while his horses consider a wooden obstacle. Toll collectors obliged, typically after verifying the messenger's impressive hat. In a few places, charters explicitly exempted whole categories of people pilgrims on particular roads, certain guilds on certain feast days from payment. The presence of these exceptions turned toll tables into oddly comforting patchworks, where right next to 3 deniers for a loaded ox cart, you might find no charge for the bare word on St. Michael, Este, a clause which, though rarely invoked, makes late-night reading much more entertaining than intended. As routes thickened and commerce grew more ambitious, tolls became part of longer chains. A merchant hauling cloth from an inland weaving town to a distant fair might find himself stopping again and again. Bridge toll, road toll, city gate toll, market stall fee. Each demanded its share, each justified as contribution to something useful. Guides and handbooks appeared to help navigate this landscape of small demands. They listed which crossings were cheap, which were notorious for delays, where you might encounter someone determined to weigh every sack, and where the keeper was rumored to be lenient if approached before breakfast. Choosing the right route was less about geography than about one's tolerance for conversations with people holding horizontal pieces of wood. Many opted, quite sensibly, for paths that promised predictable boredom. In river towns, the same logic extended onto the water. Chains could be stretched across channels, or low bridges required payments from boats sliding beneath. Toll towers watched both road and stream, taking coins from those who floated as well as those who rolled. There were careful distinctions between empty boats returning home and full ones heading out, between fishing vessels, passenger craft, and rafts piled with timber that left little room for extra arguments. Even here, with currents tugging and sails flapping, the tone remained politely procedural. People waited, ropes creaked, someone counted barrels, a clerk entered a brief note. The barrier lifted, and the world resumed its slow movement. In the long run, the record books speak more loudly than any shouted complaint from an impatient barge captain. Of course, nicknames and private jokes gathered around particular gates. A very strict collector might be known as the Iron Bar, not because of his equipment, but his personality. Another, unusually kind, might get a reputation for letting certain local farmers pay late when harvests were thin, their debts tracked in careful margins. Toll houses became landmarks for directions. Turn left after the old gate, meet me just inside the western bar. On stormy nights, their tiny windows shone like unromantic lighthouses for travelers grateful that somebody had to stay awake. Yet for all this familiarity, the job remained slightly apart. The collector served the lord, the council, the charter. His personal opinions about each cart's cargo seldom made it into the official sums, though you can imagine long, inward commentary about poorly stacked hay. As states centralized and began thinking in straighter lines, many scattered tolls were swept into larger systems. Some were abolished, at least on paper, to encourage trade. Others were standardized into broader road taxes. Barriers came down or were left raised more often than not. The little houses did not always vanish immediately. Some turned into guard posts or way stations. Others became homes, sheds, or inns. The old tariff boards, once updated with serious ceremony, faded under dust. Travelers still passed, now without pausing to count wheels allowed with a stranger. The habit of stopping dwindled, but traces remained in language and layout. A bend in the road where traffic narrows a cluster of buildings near a bridge, a place name hinting at bar, gate, or pontage, often points to where someone once required you to wait just long enough to notice the countryside. Looking back, the long life of these toll gates is oddly comforting. They were never intended to be thrilling. Their purpose was to slow things down slightly, convert motion into maintenance, make sure that the weight crossing a structure helped pay to keep it standing. Along the way, they trained people in a small ritual of acceptance. That passage between places comes with responsibilities measured not only in miles, but in those tiny exchanges at thresholds. Modern equivalents still exist in menus, tickets, and digital confirmations, but the medieval version had better scenery and more chickens. No single gate changed the world, but together they formed a net of tiny habits that held roots in place. So as you drift now, you might imagine a quiet stretch of road leading to a low gatehouse, its roof sagging just slightly, smoke curling from a small chimney. The wooden bar rests across the path. A cart approaches at an unhurried pace, wheels crunching gravel. The keeper steps out, exchanges a few words, counts bundles with a glance, and receives a couple of coins that clink softly into his box. He lifts the bar. The cart moves on. Nothing dramatic has happened. The bridge ahead will be repaired when the season calls for it. The notes in today's ledger will join all the others in a chest somewhere, numbers that once meant planks and wages, and occasionally arguments about geese. The road falls quiet again. The bar lowers with a gentle thud. And in that simple, repetitive motion up, down, pass, record, you can let your own thoughts slow to the same rhythm until every unnecessary urgency has been charged its small fee and waved peacefully away. You might not expect a folded slip of parchment carried in someone's sleeve to decide who is allowed to sleep in which courtyard, but for a surprisingly long time, medieval travel moved at the speed of permits. A traveler might have a safe conduct from a lord, a letter from a monastery, a stamped sign from a guild, or nothing. At all, just a hopeful expression and a cart that looked too suspicious. Gatekeeper exactly like every cart that had ever pretended to be harmless. If you are still awake by the time we wander into the regulations for how long a pack horse is allowed to stand inside a fortified inn yard before counting as resident livestock, you are more than welcome to subscribe for more of these bedtime complications. But honestly, drifting off somewhere around the third category of guest is the most courteous possible response to medieval paperwork. On any long road, the first thing you notice, if you are not in a hurry, is that distances were measured by opportunities to stop, rather than by miles. Charters and itineraries count in days. From this town to that abbey, from that abbey to the hospice near the bridge, From the hospice to another town with a good well, way stations grew into this rhythm. Some were official xenodokia established by bishops, hospices maintained by orders, imperial post houses, and more organized realms. Others were just practical, big farms whose owners got used to guests appearing with plausible stories and small coins. To bring a little order to this parade of dusty strangers, letters of passage became more common. Pilgrims might carry a note from their parish priest confirming that, yes, this person is indeed going to a holy place and not merely relocating away from unpaid debts. Merchants had guild cards, little badges or seals that suggested they belonged to a community that would be disappointed if they disappeared mysteriously. Envoys had safe conducts from princes or kings, written in firm Latin and sealed with wax that encouraged innkeepers and tollmen to pretend, for the length of one transaction, that geopolitics made sense. The language of these documents has a steady, sleep-inducing charm. They commend to all faithful men. The bearer asks that he be allowed to travel without hindrance, requests that no one molest his person or goods, and politely hint that any harm done to him might annoy someone with soldiers. The same phrases repeat across countries and centuries, rearranged like furniture in familiar rooms. They specify an interval, valid until Easter, valid for one pilgrimage, valid for 40 days, as if danger and hospitality could be turned on and off like a lantern. They rarely mention muddy roads, suspicious customs officers, or inns that had run out of beds 3 hours ago. The travel permit existed in a pleasantly flat realm where people read wax seals carefully and behaved accordingly. On the ground, innkeepers squinted at the bearer's face, at the seal, at the weather, and decided how literally they felt like honoring distant promises that evening. At established way stations, categories of guests developed like layers of sediment. Some houses were for the poor, some for pilgrims, some for merchants, some for royal messengers who refused to share space with anyone whose luggage did not include at least one ribbon document. Rules appeared on wooden boards, priority for the sick and the clergy, then those arriving before dark, then others as space permits. A traveler with credentials could produce them like a key. One without might rely on charm, recommendation, or the subtle argument of having brought news. Lists survive where wardens noted who stayed. 2 brothers of such and such order, a merchant from Lucca, a certain man from no known place. Lodging granted for one night only. The act of writing it down made everyone feel that the system existed, even when decisions came down to whether the guests looked likely to steal the spoons. Pilgrim routes added their own paperwork. Those heading to famous shrines often joined confraternities that issued small certificates or cloth signs, signs just distinctive enough that hospices along the way recognized them. At some stops, doors were literally marked for paupers peregrini, poor pilgrims, who would receive simple food and straw in communal halls. Better-funded travelers showed letters stating they were on vow-fulfilling business and might be given a corner with a real blanket. The border between piety and tourism was already pleasantly blurry. A person traveling with a mixture of religious intent and commercial curiosity could collect stamps, badges, blessings, and perhaps a few orders. Like an early loyalty program whose only reward was continued movement. Somewhere a clerk carefully entered their name in a register in case anyone, at any point, wanted to audit devotion. Merchants, whose livelihood depended on not having their goods detained by every local authority with a new idea, became heavy users of letters and safe conducts. Trading towns issued certificates promising that members of certain guilds had already paid appropriate dues back home. Princes eager for commerce granted letters of protection to whole communities, promising that so long as they behaved and paid, they might pass through checkpoints with minimal annoyance. The details were beautifully conditional. Protection applied except in times of war, plague, harvest failure, or unspecified royal necessity, which is to say it applied exactly as long as nothing interesting happened. Still, a folded parchment with a recognizable seal was better than an empty hand. It gave the innkeeper something to read while pondering whether to quote the higher or lower storage fee for your barrels. The physical spaces of permission were quietly theatrical. A traveler entered a walled town at its gate, where a porter or guardhouse waited with a bench, a hook for lanterns, and an official who had practiced both suspicious frowning and courteous nodding. Those on recognized business displayed their papers. The guard counted pack animals, asked what was being carried, and sometimes directed them to specific inns. In some cities, important visitors were told in advance where to stay, so that the authorities knew where to find them if their business suddenly required clarification. Lesser guests chose among establishments distinguished by carved signs rather than star ratings. The lion, the crown, the three pigeons, the inexplicable boot. Inside, certain rooms became traditional for certain kinds of people, a geography of hospitality that regular travelers memorized more carefully than any map. Way stations operated as slow information hubs. Notices from councils might be read aloud in common rooms. Letters could be entrusted to the next reasonably sober messenger heading in the right direction. Permits and passes were checked not just at borders but within regions, especially where lords wanted to know who was crossing their lands with wagons suspiciously full of untaxed cloth. One can picture the evening routine in a busy inn yard. Grooms settling horses, servants unloading bales, the host counting beds, the local official dropping by with a small ledger to confirm that yes, all is still under polite control. It is all logistics and lists, the background hum that allows the occasional dramatic journey to exist at all without losing its luggage permanently. Of course, creativity flourished wherever seals were required. For every carefully granted letter of passage, there were forgeries, imitations, and documents stretched beyond their intended lifespan. Some travelers scraped old wax and replaced it with new impressions, like reusing a particularly convincing parking pass. Scribes with flexible ethics produced permits that were almost genuine, in the sense that the words had all appeared in official templates somewhere at some time. Authorities responded with more elaborate seal designs, special ribbons, complex formulations of names and titles that would be difficult to guess. The arms race remained charmingly slow. The stakes were rarely catastrophic. At worst, someone received a stern lecture and a fine, or a night in the town jail, which for many medieval inns was simply the room you would have avoided anyway. Certain orders specialized in hospitality and brought a steadier rhythm to this world of slips and stamps. Along alpine passes, foundations maintained hospices where monks or lay brothers took in snow-dusted travelers irrespective of paperwork, provided they did not cause too much noise. In port cities, houses for foreign merchants combine lodging, storage, and a mild form of surveillance, making sure that both goods and guests stayed within reach of the right officials. Here, entry might require a mix of letters, one from home confirming status, one from the host city, granting temporary rights, and one from the ship as captain, testifying that nobody had tried to set fire to anything on the voyage. It sounds excessive until you remember that this administrative embroidery was stretched across journeys measured in weeks. A few extra signatures were a small price to pay for predictable soup. Meanwhile, local people developed an instinctive literacy in the appearance of authorization. They could not always read the Latin, but they knew the color of the bishop's wax, the look of the duke's arms, the weight of a lead seal attached to royal mail. A traveler flourishing a suspiciously clean blank piece of parchment received the same look we reserve today for an email with too many exclamation points. On the other hand, a person arriving with a worn, folded letter bearing an old but recognizable seal might be trusted even if the text had faded. Reputation extended beyond individuals to formats. The world ran on templates as much as on people. As time went on and monarchies centralized, the idea of general passports, documents not just for specific missions, but for being out of place at all, slowly took shape. Early examples permitted movement during wars or around outbreaks of plague, certifying that the bearer was not an obvious threat. They listed names, descriptions, sometimes destinations. Yet even then, enforcement was irregular. At countless minor crossings, nobody asked. The paper remained folded and clean, a theoretical object waiting for a theoretical inspection that rarely materialized. The habit of carrying such things built a quiet assumption that movement and documentation belonged together, even if the documentation spent most of its career napping. If all this sounds immeasurably fussy for a world that also produced dramatic epics and loud battles, that is exactly the point. Most people, most of the time, moved peacefully from one bed to another with the help of other people whose job it was to keep lists, open doors, and occasionally tap a document with an approving finger. The great stories of conquest and rebellion skim lightly over this substratum of guest registers, ferry permits, and notes authorizing someone to buy oats in the next market without being mistaken for a thief. Yet without these small assurances, the big journeys would have been shorter and ended earlier, usually in arguments at the first checkpoint. So as you let your breathing slow, you might picture one of those ordinary evenings on a long road. Dusk is settling. Ahead stands an inn with a lantern hung over its door, a sign creaking just enough to sound sincere. In the yard, a clerk sits with a small pile of folded parchments, checking the names of those who have arrived and those expected. A merchant produces a crumpled letter stamped months ago in another country. The clerk nods and marks a line. A pilgrim shows a cloth badge. Someone points them toward the cheaper beds. A messenger, too tired to boast, simply falls asleep with his safe conduct still tucked under his belt. No one hurries. Somewhere in the quiet, a careful hand closes the register for the night, placing it beside a little pot of sand and a cooling candle stub. The road beyond the walls is dark now, a line of possibility postponed till morning. For the moment, all the wandering intentions of the day are sheltered by nothing more dramatic than signatures, and trusts stacked neatly like folded blankets, while the world, and you with it, can safely drift into the kind of soft, undemanding sleep that paperwork has been encouraging for centuries. You might not expect a single bell rope to decide when thousands of people were supposed to stop shopping, stop gossiping, and ideally stop setting things on fire, but for several careful centuries, that was more or less the idea. Somewhere in the center of town, a bell hung ready, and when it rang at evening shutters, should close taverns, should quiet candles, should shrink, and the streets should become the jurisdiction of people who liked walking around with lanterns and keys. If you are somehow still awake by the time we get to the regulation about how long after the bell a loaf of bread could legally continue being baked, you are warmly invited to subscribe for more of this. But truly, falling asleep while we discuss municipal bedtime policies would make every medieval alderman proud. The curfew bell did not usually sound dramatic. It was not the frantic clang of alarm or the heavy toll of funerals. It was a measured, repetitive tone, saying the same thing at roughly the same time every evening, that the day had been sufficient. Charters specified it. In some places, the bell was rung at sunset, in others a fixed number of strokes after twilight. In a few, especially mathematical towns, at a calculated coverfew point by which all open hearths were in theory to be banked or covered. The stated reasons were sensible: fire prevention in cramped wooden streets, encouragement of rest, protection against wandering trouble. Unstated were the conveniences for those in charge. It is easier to run a town where most people agree on when to stop loudly doing things. The schedule became part of daily rhythm. Craftsmen glanced at the sky, estimated how long before the bell, and decided whether to start another task or not. Children learned the sound as the official signal to argue about coming indoors. Dogs, who did not read ordinances, simply adapted to whatever the humans did after the third or fourth evening tone. Once the bell had spoken, city rules often slipped into a different mode. Unnecessary fires should be damped, shop shutters closed, wandering slowed to a trickle. The word curfew itself, from couvre-le-feu, reminded residents that it was their coals, not their souls. The authorities were primarily worried about, although both were ideally kept contained. Watchmen took over the streets, some appointed by councils, others by guilds or neighborhoods, each equipped with lanterns, staves, and a satisfying quantity of procedural authority. Their duties were spelled out in ordinances with a sleep-inducing thoroughness. To patrol the lanes, to challenge unknown persons, to look for open flames near thatched roofs, to ensure that taverns did not sell wine beyond the agreed hour to people whose judgment had already gone home without them. Reading those rules is like listening to a gentle, repetitive lullaby about other people's responsibilities. The soundscape of evening changed in response. Blacksmiths let their forges cool. Markets folded their stalls with a last rustle of canvas. The ambient hammering and calling settled into softer indoor noises. A few lamps still burned in upper windows, privileges of wealth or necessity, but their light was expected to stay politely inside. In some cities, lanterns at key crossroads remained lit, hung from iron brackets, puddling feeble gold onto cobbles. The contrast between the day's clamor and the organized dullness after curfew was not absolute, but it was intentional. Authorities imagined an ideal town where honest people retreated to their hearths at a predictable hour, leaving only guards and late-shift bakers abroad. Reality, as usual, contained more cousins, love affairs, and forgotten errands than regulations anticipated. But the bell drew a line that everyone could hear, even if half treated it as a suggestion. The watchmen themselves occupy a quietly amusing corner of this history. Their job was to combine vigilance with repetitive strolling, to be conspicuously awake while encouraging everyone else to cease being so. Many towns required that they call out the hours in a reassuring sing-song. 10 o'clock and all is well, or the local equivalent, regardless of whether all was in fact well. The practice was partly to prove they were doing their rounds, partly to give insomniacs a sense that someone out there was at least counting on their behalf. Some added weather commentary: rain, wind, frost. A few verses survive in which watchmen used rhymed couplets to remind people to guard their candles, lock their doors, and consider the state of their souls, like a slow-moving combination of alarm system and motivational poster. It is very hard to commit crimes requiring subtlety while a man with a halberd is loudly announcing both the exact time and the moral hazards of loitering. There were uniforms of a sort, cloaks in city colors, metal badges, sometimes hats that looked more official than practical. They carried staves or halberds, more for symbolism than frequent use, and lanterns whose smoky light ensured that whatever they illuminated looked guilty by default. Instructions told them which streets to prioritize, where to pause and listen, when to check that gates were shut. They also included warnings against falling asleep in doorways, drinking excessively on duty, or accepting bribes from citizens who wished the rules to bend discreetly for one more jug of ale. The existence of these warnings in multiple towns suggests a certain pattern of human behavior, and a certain amount of paperwork produced by people who had found a watchman dozing and felt that minutes should be taken. Curfew was not only about silence, it was also about drawing lines between permitted and suspicious movement. Many ordinances state that after the bell, no one may walk armed through the streets, save honest men on rightful business, a category, defined almost entirely by whether the watch liked the look of you. Those caught out late were supposed to give a good reason, a sick relative, a returning journey, an urgent message, or employment that did not fit neatly into daylight, such as baking tomorrow's bread. Bakers, in fact, appear in records with delightful frequency. Their ovens had to be heated at inconvenient hours, so loaves would be ready by morning, which meant technically that their fires were exactly the kind of thing curfew rules did not want. Towns responded with carve-outs. Bakers were allowed to light ovens at such and such times, provided chimney flues were sound, neighbors did not complain too loudly, and inspectors could drop by to nod at the brickwork. Imagine the drowsy satisfaction of a council meeting devoted entirely to defining when a loaf becomes too late. In ports and river towns, the system stretched to cover ships in quays. After curfew, loading and unloading might be restricted, not out of hostility to commerce, but to prevent torches, rope, and barrels from combining into unwanted spectacles. Lights on board had to be shaded, noise kept down. Foreign sailors wishing to tramp about ashore after hours needed permission. Otherwise, they were encouraged to discover the timeless joys of staying on their vessel. Lists survive of which taverns were allowed to serve whom and how late on market nights, full of phrases like, "so that the peace of the town be not disturbed," which is a politely roundabout way of saying no singing under the mayor's window after the bell. Not everyone appreciated being told when to go home, of course. In many places, curfew enforcement softened over time. Ringing remained, but penalties faded. Sometimes the bell continued out of habit long after anyone bothered to notice. Chronicles mention towns where the evening bell, once a stern reminder, became a convenient cue for supper or the moment theater began, rather than ended. This transformation from command to background noise is oddly soothing. Rules, repeated long enough without vigor, simply turn into sounds, the clanging equivalent of wallpaper. A traveler might ask, "What is that?" and be told, "Oh, the old curfew." You can ignore it, which is how most of history survives. There are tiny, specific curiosities tucked into all this. Some bells were rung from towers that also served as watch posts, so the same man who spotted fire or enemies by day signaled bedtime by evening. A few towns required that the bell be heard 3 or 4 times, in case someone was half paying attention. In one record, a complaint notes that the bell ringer had developed a habit of starting early to shorten his working day, effectively moving the whole town's official bedtime forward by stealth until the council, presumably deprived of their dessert, intervened. In another, the mechanism was improved with ropes running down to street level so that no one had to climb stairs in bad weather. These adjustments rarely make it into grand narratives, but imagining them gives the whole system a faint air of domestic comedy. Meanwhile, the idea that there was a correct time at which the town should quiet down encouraged more precise ways of knowing that time. Sundials did their best until clouds intervened. Water clocks and candles offered alternatives inside monasteries. Mechanical clocks joined in later with creaking gears and falling weights. Civic clocks were often first installed to signal curfew and market hours, their faces added almost as an afterthought. The bell that once rang on guesswork now rang according to a device that itself needed winding and regulation, introducing another layer of people who could be mildly scolded if the town's daily exhale happened 10 minutes off. This is how we arrive, very gently, at the notion of standardized time, not just for trains and telegraphs, but for agreeing on when everyone should stop roasting things next to flammable beams. As street lighting improved, torches, lanterns, oil lamps, then gas curfew bells lost some of their leverage. Brighter nights tempted longer opening hours, and authorities faced the prospect of either adjusting the rules or enforcing them against everyone's convenience. Predictably, compromises multiplied. In some cities, curfew remained only as a fire warning. Cover your hearths, but feel free to chat. Elsewhere, it shrank to a relic rung on certain days, half ceremony, half metronome for historians. Yet the same instincts migrated into newer forms. Polite notices about quiet hours in apartment blocks, regulations on when shops may open or close, streetlights dimming at set times. The details changed. The basic wish to choreograph a collective wind down lingered, pleasantly bureaucratic. If we let all these little fragments sit together, the curfew bell stops looking like an instrument of oppression from gloomy tailies and instead resembles what it mostly was, a public reminder to reduce the odds of accidents in a world built from timber and proximity. It coordinated bakers and watchmen, signaled to taverns when to discreetly pour the last cup, helped mothers say now instead of soon to reluctant children, and gave night patrols a start time stamped in sound. It is difficult to attach a heroic narrative to that. It is fundamentally the story of an early bedtime, negotiated daily between ordinance and habit. So as you lie there and your own room darkens, you might imagine a town square at the edge of dusk. The air is cooling, market stalls are mostly folded. A few late voices drift away down alleys. Up in the tower, the bell hangs patient. A rope moves. The metal swings. Notes fall out across the rooftops with unhurried regularity. People hear it, acknowledge it in whatever way suits them, by snapping a shutter closed, banking a small fire, or merely noting that another day has been gently measured. The watchmen start their slow walk, lanterns bobbing. A baker checks his flues one last time. Somewhere a clerk agrees with himself that all is in order for tonight. The sound fades, leaving just the soft scuff of footsteps on stone. Nothing demands your attention. The town has, in its mildly fussy way, reminded itself to rest, and you can let that same suggestion reach you too, as the echoes thin out in the world. With great administrative politeness, grows quiet. You might not expect the weight of yesterday's bread to have its own legal history, but for several centuries in Europe, an impressive number of adults devoted impressive amounts of time to deciding how big a proper loaf should be. Not the recipe, not the crust color, just the exact relationship between grain prices, oven habits, and the lump of food on your table. If you are still awake by the time we reach the part where someone has to carry an official city loaf around as a portable standard, you are gently welcome to subscribe for more of this measured carbohydrate content. But truly, letting your eyelids close somewhere between the second and third weight category would be entirely in tune with the topic. It is difficult to think of anything more politely soporific than municipal enthusiasm for flour math. When grain was scarce and bread was central, authorities worried about two things: that people would go hungry, and that bakers would take advantage of confusion while pretending they, too, could not count. The solution, very sensibly, was to write rules. The assize of bread in England, similar statutes elsewhere, decreed that when the price of wheat changed, the size of the standard loaf must change with it, so customers always received an honest amount for a fixed coin. The loaf itself became elastic. Its price did not. Tables were compiled listing for each possible grain price how many ounces of bread must be sold for a penny. Some of these tables stretch on in a way that feels carefully designed to lull. At so many shillings per quarter of wheat, the wasteful. A fine white loaf should weigh so much. The cocket, a slightly less aristocratic flour arrangement, should weigh a little more. The darker simnel or household loaves more again. People who only wanted to eat were not expected to memorize this. That duty fell to officials who seemed genuinely content to. Bakers, under the system, became quiet participants in a public math lesson. When grain prices rose, they were required to reduce the size of their loaves but keep the price steady, an early and very transparent version of what we now call shrinkflation. Except here, the government insisted on it and wrote the numbers on parchment. When grain prices fell, loaves were supposed to grow, which must have felt momentarily festive. If a baker misjudged, they risked being accused of selling underweight bread, a phrase that appears in court records with the frequency and drama of a yawn. It is, by definition, unexciting. The penalties, though, have a certain sleepy theater to them. Fines, lectures, public displays of the offending loaves, and in some places the charmingly named pillory for bakers, an apparatus where dishonest. Bread was hung around a person's neck as a kind of educational accessory. The threat lurked more than it happened. Most of the time, bakers and inspectors simply negotiated grams dot. To make any of this possible, there had to be standards. Towns kept official weights locked in boxes or chained to tables. Sometimes an entire standard loaf was baked and preserved as a reference, although time and mice had strong opinions about that plan. Inspectors, beadle, or ale cunner equivalents for bread went from shop to shop with balances in hand. They bought sample loaves, sliced them open without ceremony, and weighed them against the standard. It was not glamorous, but it was oddly intimate, the health of the community measured in small golden brown units. Records show meticulous notes. So many bakers found sound, so many warned, so many loaves confiscated and given to the poor or ceremonially destroyed. One can imagine the particular quiet that settles over a bakehouse when everyone waits to see. If the numbers align, like students watching a teacher mark their exercise books in real time, the loaves themselves carried more classification than modern shelves might suggest. There were wheat loaves for the wealthy, mixed grain loaves for ordinary people, darker rye or maslin loaves for those who lived closer to the edge, and specialty types that wandered in and out of fashion. The statutes differentiated among them with a fascination bordering on affectionate. A finer flour loaf, having undergone more sifting, was allowed to be lighter at the same price because more effort and more waste had been involved. A coarser loaf had to give more weight since it used more of the grain. Even crust was quietly politicized. The inspector did not care about crunch so long as the interior mass performed correctly on the scales. Somewhere between all these categories, a medieval diner simply decided which bread looked inviting and trusted that a man with a balance and an inky pen would take care of the fairness overhead. The mildly absurd part is how often councils revisited these numbers. Grain prices changed with weather, war, and rumor. Thus, so did tables. Clerks updated them, copying columns of figures into fresh ordinances with a solemnity usually reserved for theology. They stipulated that the news schedule must be read aloud at market crosses, so everyone knew what to expect, thereby providing entire communities with long numerical sermons about ounces. Imagine standing in a square while an official voice declares, "If wheat be sold at so many shillings the quarter, then the white loaf of a farthing shall weigh 14 ounces and no less," and then continues for several pages. No wonder cats sleeping on windowsills learned to nap through public announcements. The audience did not need each detail. They only needed to know that someone might listen enough to keep them updated. Subtle frictions naturally developed. Bakers complained that rules did not account for moisture loss during cooling or the slight variations of wood-fired ovens. Inspectors countered that air did not excuse missing crumbs. Some towns allowed a tiny margin, the good man's loaf, a touch heavier than required to avoid trouble. Others insisted that if there must be error, it should be in the customer's favor. A few bakers, anxious or proud, produced loaves reliably overweight, donating a few grams to communal harmony. Over time, habits formed. This shop is known to be generous, that one to be suspiciously precise. People chose where to buy based on gossip and stomach. While the assize hovered over everyone like a politely nagging aunt, because humans enjoy adding ceremony to the practical, inspections sometimes became semi-public events. On certain days, the town's officials processed through the streets with weights and measures, visiting ovens amid mild fanfare. Children followed, fascinated by the drama of scales tilting. Loaves judged sound might receive a nod. Those found lacking could be tossed into a basket as forfeiture. These were not riots. They were rituals of reassurance. Here is our bread, duly weighed. Here is our administration, awake enough to care. It is difficult to imagine a softer form of power than confiscating slightly substandard rolls and handing them to nearby poor people with a murmur about compliance. Beyond cities, in villages and estates, the same concerns echoed with fewer documents. Lords who ran mills and ovens wanted to avoid accusations of cheating their tenants too openly. Tenants wanted to avoid starving. Custom grew up around expected weights. Some places used wooden measuring boxes for flour, a bushel of such and such dimensions that everyone recognized. Others used tall communal baking ovens into which measured doughs were slid by turns, allowing an informal comparison of whose loaf looked suspiciously small. In this environment, the social pressure to be honest sat alongside occasional, quiet adjustments with a knife when nobody was looking. Once again, we are far from heroic narrative, and comfortably close to the sort of petty negotiation that makes for excellent background noise when trying to sleep. Over centuries, estates centralized and currencies stabilized, bread regulation did not disappear so much as refine itself. Official inspectors folded bread weighing into broader duties covering meat, ale, butter, and any commodity capable of subtle shrinkage. Printed posters replaced hand-copied tables. Metric eventually arrived to reorganize ounces into grams with the same stern gentleness. The purpose stayed intact, and something as basic as bread, people dislike feeling tricked. Laws protecting them from invisible reductions persisted in codes and ministries, producing more charts, more guidelines, and more people whose job it is to think seriously about slice thickness. There is comfort in that continuity. New machines mix the dough, but somewhere an office still cares about what portion of flour cost becomes crust. Of course, the culture around bread could not resist a little pride. Cities famous for particular loaves' crusty bowls here, ring-shaped breads, their wrapped regulations and identity. Baker guilds set entrance rules, tested apprentices, insisted on ingredients. Breaking those standards was not just a technical offense. It was a slight against the city's sense of self. And yet even these proud declarations descend quickly into contentedly dull procedure. Permitted oven hours, wood allowances, permitted shapes, approved stall locations. Street markets learn to arrange their bread in visually satisfying ways while staying just inside the required weights. A choreography of abundance managed by people who had memorized half the table and improvised the rest. If you let your attention soften, what emerges from all this is less a story about conflict and more a slow, collective attempt to make daily life less arbitrary. The measured loaf is a promise that breakfast will not depend entirely on the baker's mood, that a coin slipped across a counter means roughly the same sustenance from week to week. It is an agreement maintained by officials with scales, bakers with routines, and consumers with the mild courage to complain when slices seem thin. Nothing explodes. Reforms are adopted in the form of new columns, new stamps, new standardized pans. The greatest drama is sometimes a debate over whether this year's harvest justifies reducing the penny loaf by 1 ounce or 2. No troubadour composed epics about that meeting, which is exactly what makes it excellent company as your breathing slows dot. So you might picture now a dim lane at dawn in some long ago town. Oven doors open, exhaling heat. Bakers move quietly, shaping dough that has risen in the dark. On a bench nearby, an official set of weights waits in a small wooden box, its brass surfaces catching a hint of firelight. Later, someone in a plain cloak will stop by, set a fresh loaf on the balance, watch the arm settle almost perfectly level, and say nothing more dramatic than, "It is good." Customers will come and go, their coins and loaves changing hands in a rhythm so familiar no one needs to think about statutes while they chew. The records of the day, if anyone writes them, will be a few numbers on a page. And as you follow that gentle sameness, you can let your own thoughts fall into line with it. Predictable, measured, safe, like slices from a carefully weighed loaf, until the last crumb of wakefulness is quietly, contentedly gone. You might not expect a mossy stone half sunk in a hedge to have its own legal personality, but for a very long time, boundary markers were treated with more respect than some minor nobles. A lump of rock, if placed in the right spot with the right witnesses, could quietly decide where one world ended and another began. Fields, parishes, lordships, even countries leaned on these modest objects, which is quite an achievement for stones that spent most of their careers being rained on. If you're somehow still awake by the time we get to the ceremony of walking small children around the parish to tap their heads against landmarks for educational purposes, feel free to subscribe for more bedtime geography. But truly, falling asleep while we list the varieties of official pebbles is the appropriate emotional response. Imagine a landscape before bright maps, when most lines of authority were known in bodies and stories rather than in colored ink. To show where rights began or stopped, people set markers, big stones, small stones, posts, carved crosses on bedrock, occasionally an unusually stubborn tree. These things were not decorative. A boundary stone once placed became evidence. Charters described them in long chains of phrases, from the old oak by the stream to the large stone on the hill, thence to the forked ash, and along the ridge to the stone called Hunger, which sounded poetic until someone had to locate hunger 100 years later. The texts read like gentle riddles for future land surveyors. Local people knew them, though. They walked past them with wagons and sheep, glanced at them while cutting turf. Let them vanish into the normal background of knowing. The way you know where your kitchen ends and the hallway begins without needing tape on the floor, because stones neither talk nor file reports. Human beings built habits around them to keep their meaning from drifting as slowly as they did. One of the most persistent habits was the annual or occasional beating of the bounds, a practice cheerfully descriptive in name and quietly thorough in function. Representatives of a parish or village clergy, wardens, elders, and expendable boys would walk the entire boundary, stopping at each marker to pray, sing, or strike it with sticks. Children were sometimes bumped gently against stones or dipped briefly in streams along the line to make sure they remembered their locations far into adulthood. It was a combined geography lesson and mnemonic device. Nobody forgets. The corner where they were inverted over a ditch while the church wardens sang psalms. There is something wonderfully over-engineered about using mild childhood trauma as a storage medium for cadastral data. But it worked. The stones themselves were sometimes marked in ways that would reassure only a patient observer. Crosses chiseled into their faces, initials of neighboring lords, dates of agreements, all carved with the optimistic belief that future generations would recognize both the letters and the political situation they implied. Some bore small cups or hollows. Some were set atop existing natural boulders. Others were plain slabs whose only distinction was being mentioned in documents. In borderlands where counties or dioceses met, one could find clusters of markers standing together like shy diplomats, each carrying a different insignia but sharing the same patch of soil. No one asked if the stone got confused. Its job was simply to exist and to be pointed at by people explaining where the tithe for these cabbages should go, moving. A boundary stone without permission was treated as a moral failure, as much as a practical one. Laws and sermons agreed, cursed be the one who shifts his neighbor's landmark. It appears in religious texts, royal edicts, and local bylaws with persistent emphasis, suggesting that enough people were tempted to do it, that repeating the rule felt wise. The offense combined theft, deceit, and the hope that nobody remembered where the stone used to sit. In practice, catching someone at it required a level of attentiveness rarely applied to geology. Hence, again, the walking of the bounds. When a new discrepancy was found, this stone looked strangely relocated. This marker not quite where grandfather remembered elders argued. Witnesses testified, and occasionally, a compromise was hammered out involving replacement stones and wounded pride. No ballads were composed, but quite a few very long meetings were held. Church lands had their own networks of markers. Monasteries, keen on knowing which meadows were theirs, set crosses on rocks and inscriptions on walls. Some inscribed Pax, or the name of a saint. Others contented themselves with a simple symbol. These markers created small, invisible fences of obligation. To stand on one side was to owe rent or service to one institution. To stand an arm's length away was to owe it to another. Pilgrims and travelers rarely noticed. Shepherds did. When estates changed hands, records describing these sacred lumps became vital. One can picture weary scribes carefully copying. There is a large stone by the willow, carved with a cross, dividing our field from theirs, and doing so with the seriousness of someone writing a spell. Roads and paths acquired their own markers, cousins to boundary stones, guideposts, milestones, direction crosses. Some were as simple as an upright stone with a roughly scratched arrow pointing toward town. Others announced distances in miles, leagues, or the more approximate, a good hour's walk. Early modern authorities, enamored with order, expanded upon these, but the medieval versions were pleasantly uneven. A traveler might pass a stone labeled with one place name only to find, some hours later, another cheerfully assuming you already knew what everything was and offering no further notes. Yet even these inconsistent guides were considered crucial enough that breaking or removing them drew fines. The idea that the landscape should gently whisper advice to the passerby had taken hold. All of this made surveying, when it arrived in more systematic form, feel like both innovation and confirmation. Men with chains, rods, and eventually theodolites appeared to measure precisely what stones and memories had been approximating. They plotted lines between markers, checked whether the large stone by the ash still matched the angle in the charter, and sometimes discovered that over generations the parish had politely acquired several extra yards of meadow through the slow creep of assumption. Usually, nobody marched out with swords to reclaim them. Instead, there would be conferences, correspondence, and, very occasionally, the dignified repositioning of an elderly stone by people who apologized to it under their breath. In some cities, boundary markers crept onto building corners and pavements. Little shields or coats of arms set into walls indicated where one jurisdiction ended and another began. The bishop's liberty here, the king's peace there, the merchant guild's authority over that way. Standing with one foot on each side became an unremarked party trick centuries before tourists started doing it on international borders. At certain points, gallows rights changed abruptly, taxation switched owner, or police responsibilities blurred. The stone or inlaid plaque made no sound, but those who worked with warrants knew exactly what it meant. A suspect caught 2 paces too far in the wrong direction might technically belong to someone else's problem. It was geography as paperwork, stuck into brick with lime dot. The markers did not always choose picturesque forms. Some were simple lines cut into rock, or metal studs hammered into streets, chosen specifically to be durable rather than photogenic. Others took on odd shapes because local lore liked them that way. An especially knobbly stone might be known as the toad or the bishop's nose, its distinctive silhouette making it harder for an enterprising neighbor to slip in a replacement. If someone did attempt substitution, they had to match both weight and personality, which is a higher bar than it sounds. Still, the fact that communities worried about this is faintly endearing. For all the talk of divine right and noble power, On many days, authority came down to making sure the correct oddly shaped rock was in the correct ditch, even when political borders shifted dramatically through conquest, marriage, or the more boring treaties hammered out by men in wigs. The small markers often stayed put. New rulers might repaint, recastle, or reinterpret them, but few bothered to lug them away. The stones had practical, low-level usefulness unaffected by slogans. A treaty could redraw a frontier on paper. The people who actually moved sheep, fetched water, or argued about which parish owed which repairs still needed visible clues. So the markers accumulated layers of meaning, originally set for one count, then recognized by a duke, perhaps later acknowledged in the paperwork of a nation-state. The stone endured. Only the letterhead changed dot as you think through all this. It becomes quietly clear that the true work of these boundary stones was not enforcing separation with drama, but preventing small, constant disagreements from consuming everyone's time. A visible marker says, "We have argued already. The line is here. You may now get on with planting cabbages." It did not always stop disputes, but it provided a starting point for them, reducing the area of confusion to a narrow strip of ground and a shared memory of walking around it in spring. The effort seems disproportionate until you imagine a world without such conventions, where every fence post's position is up for debate on a windy evening. Suddenly, those boring rituals with bells and processions feel like acts of mercy. So perhaps you can picture a gentle afternoon in some earlier century. A slow file of people walks the hedges, a priest in a slightly dusty stole, a few town officers with staves, some bored youths, maybe a drummer whose enthusiasm has dramatically outlasted everyone else's. They stop at each stone. Someone reads a formula. Someone taps the marker. One of the boys is lifted so he'll remember that this is the corner where 3 properties meet. Birds go on singing regardless. A dog sniffs the stone, entirely uninterested in its symbolic load. At the end of the circuit, notes are made in a book that will be opened again next year or the year after, when someone wonders if that willow has moved. The line of the parish has been refreshed not by walls, but by walking and mild ceremony in the evening. The markers are left alone again, small shapes in fields, edges on walls, scratches on bridges, each patiently holding a thought about where one thing ends and another begins. They do not need guarding. Their very ordinariness protects them. Travelers who step over them feel nothing in particular. Only occasionally does someone glance down and remember that beneath the moss there is a chiseled sign older than their house, signed off by hands long gone. And as you let your own thoughts wander over this unhurried landscape of stones and steps and almost forgotten rituals, you might feel a similar soft outline forming around your day. Here it ends, there you rest. The boundaries do their work, so you do not have to. You can set your head down like a small weight on a very old marker and let everything else stay quietly, solidly where it is. You might not expect a length of iron chain to have a literary career, but for several gentle centuries, some of the most important books in Europe went nowhere without a small clinking sound. They were handwritten, heavy, and rare enough that letting them wander seemed morally questionable. So monasteries and colleges did the obvious thing. They attached them to the furniture. Knowledge, quite literally, on a leash. If you are still awake by the time we reach the borrowing policy that technically allowed you to take a book out only, if you were willing to leave behind an equally valuable hostage, you're very welcome to subscribe for more of this careful enthusiasm. But please don't feel obliged. Falling asleep while someone methodically explains historical shelving systems is, in its way, an homage to the librarians who wrote these rules in the first place. In a world before printing presses turned texts into quantities. A single volume might represent months of a scribe's labor, pigments carried awkwardly over mountains, and parchment that once had 4 independent opinions about grass. Losing such an object was closer to misplacing a small barn than a paperback. So chain libraries emerged, particularly from the late Middle Ages into the early modern period. Books were arranged with their spines inward and their 4 edges out, each attached to a chain, the chain running to a bar, the bar fixed to a desk or shelf. To modern eyes, it looks faintly punitive, like the books are serving a sentence, but the intention was affectionate. Better a tethered book than a missing one. Chains were long enough to let you open and read comfortably at the desk, but not quite long enough for an impulsive walk to the door. If anyone did try to leave with a volume, the combined efforts of gravity, hardware, and social embarrassment would bring them back. The result was an architecture of deliberate inconvenience. Reading benches were fixed. Aisles were narrow. The whole room softly insisted that you should sit down and stay a while. Chains scraped soothingly when moved, a faint metallic whisper under the rustle of pages. Catalogs told you which desk held which subject, and woe betide the person who swapped volumes around. Some systems numbered not just shelves, but the exact hooks. A scholar needing a particular commentary on a particular book of the Bible could follow a trail of instructions. Second row, 4th chain from the left, bound in brown, clasp on the right. By the time they reached it, their enthusiasm had usually settled into the appropriate drowsy respect. If they remained awake through the prologue, it was by choice because librarians are constitutionally unable to leave a rule unclarified. Chains came with paperwork. Foundation statutes for some libraries specify the exact thickness of links, the metals allowed, how they were to be fixed to bindings so as not to damage them, and who was responsible for repairs. One college instructed that the Custos Libra room should see that no chain is removed, shortened, or lengthened without license, an instruction that suggests at least one person had tried to customize their reading radius. Keys to the bookroom were tightly controlled. Hours were fixed and politely unfashionable. You did not wander in at midnight for a quick browse. You visited in daylight, under supervision, beside windows designed to catch just enough sun to read, but not enough to bleach. The entire system radiated steady, preventative thinking, like a very early version of, "Are you sure you want to delete this file?" But built of stone and iron, the mild absurdity emerges most clearly in the lending rules. Some institutions did allow books to leave, but only in exchange for pledges that equaled or exceeded the volume in value. Another manuscript, a piece of silver, sometimes the borrower's solemn promise backed by the credit of respectable witnesses. Registers list these exchanges in con Latin. Such and such a master has taken Augustine on such a date, leaving as pledge a volume of sermons to be forfeited should Augustine fail to reappear. One imagines the book itself slightly pleased with the arrangement. In a few cases, the pledge was considered more valuable and simply kept, a sort of accidental upgrade for the library. It was, in financial terms, an almost risk-free strategy built on the assumption that scholars are forgetful but conscientious. The text, at least, rarely ran off for romantic reasons in monasteries. Chained books often lived in cloister walks or special armaria, small cupboards with doors that open like theatrical reveals of doctrine. Reading was regulated by the hours of prayer. Nobody wanted monks so deep in Aristotle that they forgot Vespers. Catalogs from these houses read like dreamlike shopping lists, homilies, commentaries, florilegia of quotations carefully extracted, so that future readers did not have to go hunting for a good sentence. Each entry was numbered, located, sometimes described by its opening words, as if the librarian half expected to recognize it in the dark by touch and first line alone. The chained volumes were usually the ones considered most indispensable to communal life. The Bible, major fathers, canon law, medical references, a few stubbornly essential grammars. Less crucial works might be kept in separate cupboards, still locked, but not physically anchored. It was a tiered system of trust. The more people you needed to agree on what the truth was, the shorter its chained out students and early universities met a similar, gently controlled abundance. Colleges built libraries with long desks and high mullioned windows, books perched on top, chains descending into small swiveling staples at their edges. Regulations advised students not to lean on books excessively, not to scribble in margins without good reason, and not, under any circumstances, to detach the chain for convenience. Marginalia survive anyway. Doodles, complaints about weather, quiet praise of particular masters. Even the medieval equivalent of whoever steals this book may be excommunicated, written a script that suggests the writer was having a satisfying afternoon. The chain system did little to discourage commentary. It simply ensured the commentators stayed within a certain radius, like an intellectual grazing animal. Catalogs themselves became quietly intricate. To find a volume, you might consult a listing sorted by subject, by author, or by the shelf on which the book physically lived. Some combined all three in a matrix of references, cross-referencing shelves, chains, and titles until the mind is lulled into a peaceful grid. Librarians loved tables. They recorded not only what existed, but where it sat at that exact moment, a snapshot of stillness in a slow world. Updates were written in marginal notes. This book removed to the new press. This volume lent to Master so-and-so. This one entirely worn out and replaced. Each remark anchoring the restless idea of movement back into ink. It is organizational thinking used as a sedative. Reading these records, you can feel the weight of each decision, whether the medical text stays chained or joins the more mobile stock, whether the popular commentary needs a second copy to prevent queuing. Most problems were solved with another hook and another line in the ledger. Of course, chains rust. Over time, some libraries discovered that the attachments they had so dutifully installed were damaging the very treasures they meant to protect. Metal bit into leather, links scuffed painted edges. Desks were rearranged and chains ended up at unfortunate angles. Solutions ranged from careful padding to complete reconfiguration. When printing made books cheaper, chaining gradually began to look unnecessary, like locking up every spoon. Newer libraries dropped the hardware. Older ones unchained selectively, keeping only the most irreplaceable works tethered. A few places, however, kept their iron jewelry in place as tradition even when theft was unlikely and duplicates existed. There is something soothing in that stubbornness, as if the past had become fond of its own caution and could not quite bring itself to stop. In some corners, chained books coexisted with remarkably strict reading etiquette. Silence was preferred, though not always enforced. Candles were limited to prevent singed pages. Inkpots were monitored with the intensity of border checkpoints. In one set of rules, readers are reminded not to lick their fingers before turning leaves, a habit relegated to a specific circle of parchment-based hell. Shelves were dusted. Windows occasionally opened. Everything smelled of leather, metal, and slow concentration. Within this carefully maintained environment, the chains faded into the background, part of the natural order of the room, like ribs in a skeleton. New arrivals quickly understood that books were not casual objects. They were fixtures to be visited almost like relatives in a cloistered hospital, kindly, respectably, and during visiting hours. The amusing contrast, looking back, is how physically accessible the books still were if you obeyed the quiet choreography. Unlike modern closed stacks that hide volumes entirely, chained libraries displayed their collections openly. You could walk along benches and handle the very precious texts, so long as you accepted that they had no intention of leaving with you. It was a model built on supervised intimacy rather than distance. The restriction lay not in seeing the object, but in rehoming it. This arrangement trusted readers not to damage pages, while simultaneously trusting chains not to let them forget themselves at the door. It is oddly generous. You may turn my most valuable pages with your own hand, but you may not carry them through that threshold, because the book and the room are in a long-term relationship. As centuries passed, a few chained libraries survived almost unchanged little time capsules of carefulness. Visitors now shuffle through them with tour guides whispering about incunabula and original oak furniture. The chains, which once blended into everyday function, have become charming curiosities, photographed like jewelry. Rules about pledges and lecterns are explained with affectionate irony. Yet those old statutes still exist in their small script. Clauses about which master may borrow which commentary, how often inventories must be taken, what curses fall upon thieves. They sit between lines of exegesis and philosophy, reminding us that grand ideas have always needed a support structure of mildly overthought logistics. It is difficult to picture a more soporific but comforting revelation. Behind every important thought, there was once someone counting links. So as you let your eyes grow heavier, you might imagine sitting alone in one of those long, narrow rooms. Outside, the world is not in a hurry. Sunlight filters through tall windows, making a slow journey across wood worn smooth by centuries of elbows. Around you, books rest on their chains, each one within reach but unwilling to go farther. You choose one, feel the faint resist of iron, open it, and find on its first page a line of cramped Latin warning anyone who steals it of dreadful consequences. You're not going to steal it. You're barely going to finish this paragraph. Somewhere in the building, a bell marks an unimportant hour. Somewhere in a register, your quiet presence is not even noted. The chains do their silent work, keeping everything gently in place, while pages turn at the pace of breathing. And as the words grow softer and more repetitive, the clink of imagined links fades into nothing at all, leaving you, like the books, exactly where you need to be, safe, still, and ready to sleep. You might not expect a single small key to require witnesses, signatures, and its own backup key in case the first key holder forgot where he put his cloak. But for a very long time, that was considered perfectly reasonable administration. Doors, chests, towers, archives, even certain bells were all governed not just by their locks, but by quiet lists of who might hold which keys, when and under what conditions those keys could be turned. It is a long story of people carefully not opening things at the wrong time. If you're somehow still awake by the time we reach the regulation about how many people had to be present while unlocking a cupboard of Dusty Town charters, you are very gently invited to subscribe for more of this extremely secure content. But honestly, if you drift off somewhere around key number 3, that is exactly the reaction centuries of clerks would have expected in early town halls and monasteries. Important objects lived in chests of 3 keys, a phrase that appears so often in old documents it might as well be printed on a pillow. Money, seals, privileges, relics, and particularly embarrassing correspondence were placed in one stout box, which could be opened only if 3 different officers fetched their 3 separate keys and agreed, at the same moment, that today was a suitable day for access. The logic was simple. 1 person might be tempted, 2 might be persuaded, 3, in theory, would at least have to schedule their conspiracy. Council minutes record with soothing repetition that the chest was opened in the presence of, followed by a catalog of names. The opening itself was an event of modest drama. 3 locks turned, lid raised, contents rustled, figures murmured, lid closed, keys withdrawn. No trumpets, just a soft choreography of trust, and brass dot keys were more than tools. They were job descriptions. Being handed a key meant you had become, in a small, reversible way, part of the infrastructure. Gatekeepers, sacristans, cellars, keepers of the seal, custodians of archives, Each carried one or more pieces of carefully shaped metal, their responsibilities hanging quite literally from the belt. Inventories listed them. Wills bequeathed them with solemn flourishes. To such and such faithful servant, the key to the lower granary. To such and such son, the key to the counting house. Some keys were ceremonially large, deliberately impractical, meant to be seen rather than pocketed, like miniature scepters. Others were so small that losing them in a fold of clothing was both easy and, given the paperwork that would follow, spiritually hazardous. Manuals reminded holders to keep their keys on their person, not tossed on a table where a passing temptation, with nimble fingers, might pick them up along with a stray apple. Churches multiplied keys with pious enthusiasm. One set opened the main doors, another the sacristy, another the coffer where relics were kept, yet another the cupboard with liturgical plate, and importantly, at least 2 or 3 were assigned to the tabernacle where the consecrated host was reserved. Rules specified how many people had to be present to open that last one. Sometimes the priest, sometimes the sacristan as well. Occasionally, a third official whose main qualification seems to have been trustworthiness and availability. This layering of metal and morality ensured that sacred things were rarely alone with a single human impulse. Each extra key was a small still halo around the possibility of misbehavior, not that most people were plotting. Most were just mildly inconvenienced by having to track down brother so-and-so. Whenever they needed a chalice, civic life generated its own slow fluttering bouquet of keys. City gates had them, enormous objects that clanked when carried and took both hands to turn. The opening and closing of gates became ritualized, with watchmen locking up at dusk and unlocking at dawn, or at whatever hour commerce persuaded the council to define as dawn for this season. Written orders sometimes specified that no gate might be opened without at least 2 appointed keepers present, an early example of the please confirm your action philosophy. Bridges were locked at night. Chains across streets were fastened, with padlocks to gently discourage cart traffic after certain hours. Even fountains could be supplied from cisterns whose regulating valves were locked, so no one could indulge in unauthorized water enthusiasm. Somewhere in town, a small drawer held a corresponding cluster of labeled keys, an object of dazzling interest only on the single day in 15 years when someone misfiled it. Archives, the natural habitat of people who adore both paper and rules, approached key management with affectionate intensity. Deeds, charters, rail letters, and court records slumbered in cupboards whose doors were barred and bolted. Finding a particular document required not only the correct shelf and bundle, but the relevant key holder to be present in person. Some repositories insisted that 2 archivists attend every opening, one to unlock, the other to witness that nothing extra left the room nestled among notebooks. Regulations calmly specified that all locks must be tested periodically, that lost keys be reported immediately, that new keys, once cut, be recited in council so no one can later claim ignorance. Really, the main narrative tension in centuries of archival history consists of people promising, in writing, not to copy keys. The keys themselves acquired shapes that could be recognized by touch. Some had notched bows, others little crosses, others bits like mechanical ferns. In an age before electric light, being able to reach into a pouch and know by the feel which key belonged to which lock was both practical and faintly magical. One can imagine a castle warden producing the correct one in near darkness with the unhurried assurance of long practice, slotting it into a heavy lock that complains quietly before yielding. The connection between metal profiles and human memory formed its own invisible map of the building. You knew a man's responsibilities by the clatter at his waist. A ring of many keys suggested either great authority or employment by an institution with a deep fear of open doors. Where keys clustered, duplicates inevitably appeared. Authorities worried about this in their favorite way, by issuing rules. No second key might be cut without permission. No locksmith might reproduce a pattern without written order. Surrendered. Keys must be broken or kept in sealed packets to prevent future mischief. In practice, of course, people found ways. A few surviving letters show delicate complaints that there are said to be more keys in circulation than were ever granted, followed by an invitation to the council to feel concern. Very occasionally, an amnesty was declared, all unauthorized keys to be brought in and exchanged for something more respectable, like gratitude. One imagines drawers reluctantly opened and little stashes of confessing metal clinking into official bowls. Universities and colleges embraced the key as a way to structure student life. Staircases and sets of rooms had their own locks. Porters maintained lists. Latecomers encountered doors that would not cooperate. Some statutes mandated that certain gates be locked at particular hours and that keys remain only with designated officers, so that the young and inventive could not wander unobserved. Libraries, as we've already visited, had their own keys. On top of their chains, a redundancy that would bring joy to any systems administrator. The idea was not so much to imprison as to shape habits. If the only easy way out of college after dark passed under the eye of the porter and his keys, one thought twice about midnight adventures. Or at least one thought while quietly watching for his tea break. Households, too, developed small hierarchies of keys. The mistress of a large house often wore a key bunch at her waist, symbol of control over linen closets, pantries, and storerooms. Servants might be entrusted with single keys to single rooms, and the promotion to 2 keys was as clear a sign of trust as any pay rise. Inventories from probate proceedings list 1 ring of sundry keys, often without specifying what they open, as if the keys themselves, detached from locks, had become a portable record of the deceased's responsibilities. Watching those keys being handed to a successor must have carried a quiet weight. You now decide when the sugar is unlocked. This was not a trivial power in any age. Fortresses and arsenals multiplied the seriousness. Powder magazines, armories, signal beacons, all locked. Keys distributed according to rank, with cautions about never leaving them unattended. In some places, 2 men had to cooperate to open the powder store, each with part of the access, so that no overconfident officer could improvise a private war. Instructions for sieges included notes about seizing keys and capturing gatekeepers, acknowledging that these little bits of iron often mattered more than walls. Yet even here, amid more dramatic possibilities, surviving documents preserve the mundane. Logs of who had the south gate key on which date, receipts for replaced locks after keys went missing in the confusion. History's large gestures rest, it turns out, on the quiet question of whether someone remembered not to lend their ring to a cousin. Over time, as locks improved and bureaucracies expanded, more subtle systems appeared. Numbered keys matched to numbered doors. Master keys that opened entire suites, entrusted only to senior staff members who acquired the slightly haunted look of people who could, at least theoretically, enter anywhere. The language around keys softened to metaphor keys of office. Key responsibilities, key men showing how tightly the idea of controlled access had married itself to authority. But underneath these phrases lay the persistent, literal hardware, the click of tumblers, the worn shine on a frequently used bow, a small panic when a pocket felt lighter than usual. Eventually, of course, keys began to lose their mystery. Mass-produced locks lowered the cost of security. Spares could be cut at short notice. Combination systems, cards, electronic fobs, and passwords stepped onto the stage with the breezy confidence of inventions that had not yet had time to misbehave extensively. Yet the old rituals echo in new forms. 2-factor authentication is just a digital chest of 3 keys. Audit logs that record who accessed which file resemble those medieval council notes about who was present at the unlocking of the charter box. Even the simple rule, do not write your password on a sticky note, carries the same weary tone as do not leave the key on the hook by the outer door. So if you like, you can picture keys all along this stretch of time, moving slowly through pockets and palms. A rusty one turning in a church coffer at dawn. A polished one opening the gate of a small walled town as traders wait with sleepy patience. A ring of them laid carefully on a table while trustees open the library chest. Another hanging at a housekeeper's waist, tapping softly as she climbs the stairs. Each key small, specific, unthrilling, and yet part of a vast, unspoken agreement about what should remain closed until someone with the right bit of metal decides otherwise. There's no great climax here, no final door flung open, just centuries of people locking things at night and unlocking them in the morning, and writing down in neat hands that the procedure was followed. And as your eyes grow heavier, you might imagine one last small scene. An almost empty building at the end of a long day, stone cooled, papers stacked, shelves quiet. A caretaker walks the corridors, checking windows, turning latches. With each satisfied twist of a key, there is a soft, final sound like punctuation at the end of a sentence. When he is done, he gathers the ring, feels its familiar weight, and hangs it on its hook in a room that is also locked. The world outside continues, but in here everything is gently, intentionally secure. Nothing urgent will happen between now and morning. It is structurally discouraged. You do not need to guard any doors. You can let go of your own keys, real or imagined, and let the locks, and the long habit of people who cared about them, hold the quiet for you while you sleep.